The early evening sun cast a golden hue over Maplewood Park in Charleston, South Carolina, where Isabella Carter, a 39-year-old history professor, sat on a weathered wooden bench beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak tree. With a thick hardcover book resting on her lap, she turned the pages slowly, savoring the rare moment of tranquility away from her demanding career at Charleston University. The distant laughter of children playing on the swings and the rhythmic sound of joggers' feet against the gravel path created a peaceful backdrop. One Isabella cherished. It wasn't often she could afford an hour to herself, immersed in the words of her favorite historian, lost in a world far removed from the pressures of academia. That peace was abruptly shattered. The sharp screech of tires against pavement made her glance up, brows furrowing as she watched a black and white police cruiser pull up to the curb. The chatter of onlookers quieted slightly as two uniformed officers stepped out, Officer Brent Holloway and Officer Kevin Slater. Both appearing rigid, their expressions stern, their eyes swept across the park before landing squarely on Isabella, the only person sitting alone in the immediate area. She met their gaze with calm curiosity, though her instincts told her this was no routine interaction. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" Holloway called out, his tone carrying an edge that immediately put Isabella on alert. She carefully closed her book and rested it on her lap. "Of course," she responded smoothly, her voice even and composed. Slater stepped forward, his tone clipped. "We received a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Isabella's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated, genuinely puzzled. "I'm sitting here reading." She held up her book, as if proving a point. But the officers did not waver in their scrutiny. "Can we see some ID?" Holloway demanded, his hand resting near his belt. A slow, deep breath steadied Isabella's pulse. She knew this was not a request, it was a test of control. She had spent years researching power structures, authority, and the historical oppression of Black Americans, and now she found herself living one of those moments she had lectured about. "I don't understand," she said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "What law have I broken?" "It's just a routine check," Slater said, though his clipped tone suggested otherwise. By now, a small crowd had gathered nearby. A few murmurs rippled through the air, confusion, curiosity, discomfort. Some exchanged glances, sensing the imbalance in the interaction. Isabella sighed, retrieving her wallet from her tote bag. She handed over her South Carolina driver's license, watching as Holloway scrutinized the information longer than necessary. "Isabella Carter," he read aloud, almost mockingly. "What's your business here, Miss Carter?" She inhaled deeply, her patience wearing thin. "I live here," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I came to the park to read." "Is that a problem?" The officers exchanged a glance. Holloway handed back her ID. But instead of leaving, they lingered. "You always carry a book like that around?" Slater sneered. "Are you alone here, or waiting for someone?" Holloway added, his fingers lightly tapping his utility belt. Isabella recognized the subtle intimidation tactics. She had seen them used before. Read about them in countless cases of racial profiling. She chose her next words carefully. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of." Something in Holloway's expression shifted. A flicker of agitation, perhaps even anger. He stepped forward, his presence suddenly suffocating. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job. And I know the law." Isabella countered, her voice steady. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But reason was not on their agenda. Before she could react, Holloway reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he declared, though Isabella hadn't moved. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A man near the fountain pulled out his phone and began recording. A young woman with wide, anxious eyes held up her own phone, documenting the exchange. "Stop resisting," Holloway barked, louder this time, as if performing for an unseen audience. Cold metal snapped around Isabella's wrists. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. Even as humiliation and frustration burned in her chest, she would not give them the reaction they wanted. The officers led her toward their cruiser, ignoring the murmurs, the whispers, the questions from onlookers. As the car door slammed shut, Isabella turned her head, locking eyes with the young woman still recording. In that silent moment, she sent a message, Don't stop filming. Inside the cramped backseat, Isabella's mind raced. She had spent years defending the rights of others, standing up for justice, fighting systemic injustices. Now, she was on the other side of it. The absurdity of the situation struck her. But there was no humor in it. Only anger. At the station, the humiliation continued, fingerprinting, mugshots, the cold, sterile walls of a holding cell designed to strip dignity from those placed inside it. "Enjoy your stay," Holloway said smugly. Locking the door, Isabella sat on the cold bench, hands clasped tightly, her mind replaying the events at the park. How had such a simple moment of peace spiraled into this? The answer was bitterly clear. Prejudice. Hours later, she was released on bail. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her like a wave. Waiting by the curb was her best friend, Mariah Thompson, a civil rights attorney. Mariah rushed over. "Are you okay?" Isabella nodded, but her body betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm fine," she said, though the word felt hollow. As they drove away, the streetlights blurring past, Mariah hesitated before asking, "What are you going to do?" Isabella exhaled slowly. "I'm going to fight back." And she meant it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. The courtroom was eerily silent as Judge Isabella Carter ascended the bench, her black robe flowing behind her like a shadow of fate. The gavel felt heavier in her hand today, not because of its weight, but because of the history it carried. She settled into her chair, back straight, face composed, every movement deliberate, every breath measured, but beneath the calm exterior, a storm raged. Brent Holloway and Kevin Slater sat at the defense table, stiff, wide-eyed, and pale, the men who had mocked her behind closed doors, who had laughed about the power they wielded over a smart-mouthed black woman, now sat before her, vulnerable, exposed, trapped in the very system they had once weaponized against her. Isabella let the moment stretch, watching as their shoulders tensed, their hands clenched into fists on the table. Holloway, the more arrogant of the two, was sweating under the fluorescent lights. His usual cocky smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. His past misconduct reports, excessive force, racial profiling, verbal harassment, had always been buried before they could reach a courtroom. But now, there was no one to shield him. Slater, the quieter but no less dangerous one, kept his eyes on the table, his jaw tight, his fingers twitching against his knee, a nervous tic Isabella had memorized from their first encounter. She had replayed their first meeting over and over in her mind, the sharp screech of tires, the suffocating weight of suspicion in their eyes, the way their fingers hovered near their weapons as if she were a threat. She remembered the bruising grip on her arm, the way Holloway had grinned as he called her defiant and shoved her into the back of his cruiser. She had heard him and Slater laughing at the station, bragging about how they'd put her in her place. But what haunted her most was not their cruelty, it was how easily it could have been worse. How many times had a situation like hers ended with a body in the morgue instead of a courtroom? Now, they were the ones waiting to hear their fate. Isabella took a steadying breath and raised her gavel. This court is now in session. The courtroom exhaled as everyone sat down, but the weight of anticipation remained thick in the air. The misconduct case was straightforward. Holloway and Slater had tackled an unarmed teenager during a traffic stop, causing a concussion and a fractured rib. Their excuse? The young man had moved too suddenly, making them fear for their safety. The victim, a 17-year-old honor student, was still recovering in the hospital. Dashcam footage, witness testimony, and medical reports painted an irrefutable picture. These officers had once again abused their power. Holloway's lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney, cleared his throat loudly, trying to reclaim control of the room. "Your Honor," he began, forcing a polite smile. "Before we proceed, I'd like to, I assure you," Isabella interrupted, her tone sharp but measured. "This courtroom will proceed as fairly as any other I have presided over. If you have concerns about my impartiality, you are welcome to file a motion for recusal." The lawyer hesitated. He knew that a recusal motion wouldn't hold, not when the evidence was already stacked against his clients. Holloway and Slater shifted uncomfortably, knowing that they had no way out but through her. The prosecutor stood next, wasting no time. "Your Honor, the evidence against officers Holloway and Slater is clear and overwhelming. The victim did not resist, did not present a threat. Yet these officers tackled him with such force that he lost consciousness. A pause, a ripple of tension, a sharp inhale from the gallery. And yet, the prosecutor continued, this is not an isolated incident. A asterisk file was placed on Isabella's bench, thick, worn, filled with reports of excessive force complaints, all bearing the same names. Isabella's pulse hammered against her ribs. But she remained still. The pages told a story she already knew too well. Slater had been involved in 3 prior incidents of unjustified aggression, one resulting in a young black man spending a night in jail for disrespecting an officer. The charges had been dropped, but Slater had remained on the force. Holloway, however, was worse. The documents detailed 6 prior complaints of racial profiling, 4 instances of excessive force, 2 internal investigations, all dismissed before they could gain traction. One report stood out. A black mother had called in a complaint about Holloway harassing her teenage son. Holloway had stopped the boy on his way home from football practice, accused him of looking like he was up to something, and kept his hand on his gun the entire time. The complaint had been marked unsubstantiated. The boy in the report was the same teenager now lying in a hospital bed. Isabella's grip on her gavel tightened. It was a pattern that had been ignored for too long. Holloway shifted in his seat, his face pale now. He knew what this meant. This wasn't just about this case. This was about all the ones before it. And for the first time, he was out of favors. Isabella leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. I have read the case files. I have reviewed the evidence. And I will be reviewing each complaint that has been dismissed under unsubstantiated claims. Holloway's breath hitched. Slater's fingers twitched faster against his knee. They both knew. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. This was an examination of everything they had ever gotten away with. The entire courtroom felt it, the shift, the weight, the realization. Isabella turned to the prosecutor. Proceed with witness testimony. The trial was just beginning. But Isabella had already decided one thing. This time, justice would not be ignored. What happens next? Will Holloway and Slater finally face real consequences? Can Isabella remain impartial despite the history between them? What will happen when the department's secrets start unraveling? Drop your thoughts below. What should Isabella do next? Should she push for deeper investigations? Should she expose the department's history? Let's talk, and don't forget to stay tuned for the next part. Justice on trial. The consequences no one expected. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Isabella Carter prepared to deliver her ruling. The weight of the gavel in her hand felt heavier than ever. But she refused to let the moment swallow her whole. The room was packed, not just with journalists eager for a scandalous headline, not just with activists demanding justice, but with everyday people who had seen too much, who had suffered too much, who needed to know that this time, the system would not betray them. At the defense table, officers Brent Holloway and Kevin Slater sat frozen, their once cocky demeanor now replaced by the weight of what was coming. For too long, Isabella began, her voice strong, unwavering. Officers like you have relied on the power of your badge to shield you from the consequences of your actions. You have used your authority not to protect and serve, but to intimidate and harm. The tension in the room thickened. Every eye locked on her. The evidence is undeniable, she continued. Dashcam footage, witness testimony, medical records, all of it paints a picture of systematic abuse, of a pattern of targeting individuals who posed no threat, of an unchecked arrogance that led you to believe you were untouchable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Isabella's grip on the gavel tightened. As of this moment, officers Holloway and Slater, you are hereby suspended without pay, pending an independent review of your actions and all prior complaints made against you. The gasps that followed were almost deafening. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was a beginning, a door opening into something much, much bigger. Holloway's jaw tensed, his hands balling into fists on the table. He had spent his entire career evading accountability, maneuvering his way through internal affairs loopholes and backroom deals that had always saved him before. But not this time. This time, there was no one left to protect him. Slater, on the other hand, looked less angry and more afraid. His leg bounced under the table, his fingers twitching against the polished wood. Isabella wasn't done. Additionally, you are required to undergo mandatory retraining. including de-escalation tactics and anti-bias programs. Your permanent disciplinary records will reflect these offenses, ensuring that should you ever attempt to serve in law enforcement again, your history will not be erased. Holloway exhaled sharply, shaking his head. The damage was done. At that moment, he stood abruptly, drawing gasps from the gallery. Slater's eyes widened, but he remained seated, staring at his partner. Your Honor, this is a goddamn joke. Holloway's voice cracked. This whole thing is a setup, some political stunt. You think this is justice? You think you're proving something? His rage boiled over, the facade of control crumbling as officers near the entrance stepped forward, ready to intervene if needed. Isabella didn't blink. She had seen this exact performance before, the indignation, the attempt to reclaim power by making himself the victim. You've already proven plenty, Officer Holloway, she said coldly, and for once, you don't get to be the one in control. Silence. Holloway's chest rose and fell sharply, his breathing heavy. The realization was sinking in. He had lost. For the first time in his career, he had lost. A slow, heavy exhale left his lips as he sat down abruptly, his face red with frustration, his mind scrambling for a way out. That's when Slater did something no one expected. He cleared his throat. It was a small sound, barely noticeable in the courtroom's charged atmosphere. But when he looked up at Isabella, his expression wasn't defiance. It was something else. I'm sorry. It was barely above a whisper, but it echoed through the room like a gunshot. All eyes turned to him. Even Holloway turned, his face twisting in disgust. Slater hesitated, then exhaled, staring at the table as if the words were too heavy to say aloud. I was wrong. A murmur swept through the crowd. Isabella tilted her head slightly, studying him. Slater swallowed hard, his hands trembling. I was a coward, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I let it happen. I let all of it happen. And I laughed. I laughed about it. His throat bobbed as he forced the next words out. And I was wrong. Holloway hissed under his breath. Shut the hell up, Kevin. But Slater ignored him. Isabella studied him for a long moment. Was it enough? No. Words were never enough. But it was something. I hope you understand, she said, her voice quiet yet piercing, that an apology doesn't erase what's been done. Slater nodded stiffly, his gaze locked on his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. Holloway, on the other hand, seethed silently, his entire body wound so tight he looked like he might snap. Court is adjourned. Isabella brought the gavel down, the sound reverberating through the chamber like the closing of a heavy door. As the crowd erupted in conversation, Holloway stood and stormed out, shoving past reporters and onlookers without a word. Slater remained seated for a moment longer, then slowly rose, avoiding everyone's gaze. Before he turned to leave, he glanced back at Isabella, just for a second. Something in his eyes had shifted. Regret? Fear? Understanding? She wasn't sure. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. Not yet. What happens next? Will Slater's remorse lead to deeper revelations? Or is it just an act? Is Holloway truly done? Or is he planning something in the shadows? Will this ruling set a new precedent? Or will the system retaliate against Isabella for daring to expose its flaws? Tell us what you think in the comments. Should Holloway face criminal charges? Should Slater be given a second chance? And don't forget to like and follow to find out what happens next. The fight for justice is only beginning. The verdict that changed everything. The streets of Charleston, South Carolina, were alive with movement. From the courthouse steps to City Hall, voices rose in unwavering unity. A chorus of determination, frustration, and hope. This wasn't just a protest, it was a movement. A demand for real, lasting change. And at the center of it all stood Judge Isabella Carter. A woman who had fought tooth and nail for justice. A woman who had endured wrongful arrest, public scrutiny, and systemic resistance, and still refused to back down. The final ruling had been delivered. Brent Holloway, the officer who had once mocked and brutalized Isabella without a second thought, now faced criminal charges. Stripped of his badge, his once protected career reduced to nothing but a symbol of corruption finally exposed. The internal investigation that had begun as a simple misconduct hearing had ripped open decades of buried reports, revealing the department's history of racial profiling, cover-ups, and unchecked brutality. The system that had shielded him for years had crumbled beneath its own weight. But Holloway's fate was not what made history. The reforms did. For the first time in Charleston's history, a new civilian oversight board was formed, an independent council with full authority to investigate police misconduct, discipline officers, and ensure true accountability. The community, once silenced and afraid, now had a voice in the system that had once oppressed them. New policies were introduced: mandatory de-escalation training, the banning of racial profiling tactics, and stricter use of force guidelines. Officers like Holloway could no longer act with impunity. And Judge Isabella Carter? She had become more than a legal figure. She had become a symbol of resilience, justice, and reform. Yet, the moment she stepped out of the courthouse, she didn't feel victorious. Not yet. As the crowd erupted in cheers, Isabella's gaze drifted across the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers. She saw elderly men and women who had lived through the civil rights movement, who had seen this fight play out before. She saw young children holding signs with messages of hope, their parents standing beside them, determined to raise them in a world that would finally do better. She saw the pain, the exhaustion, the cautious hope in their eyes. And then, she saw Kevin Slater. He stood at the edge of the crowd, watching, uncertain, removed from the celebration but unwilling to walk away. He was no longer an officer. His badge had been stripped, his record permanently stained. But unlike Holloway, he had chosen not to fight the consequences. Instead, he had spoken out, had helped uncover the hidden misconduct within the department, had testified against the very system he once upheld. And yet, he was still an outsider. Isabella met his gaze. For a moment, they just stood there, two people on opposite sides of a history neither of them could erase. Slater gave a slight nod. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he had chosen to do something with his regret. Maybe that was enough. Isabella turned back to the crowd, stepping up to the microphone. A hush fell over the street. The people who had gathered, who had marched, who had fought alongside her, waited to hear what came next. She took a deep breath. "Today is not the end," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is just the beginning." A ripple of applause moved through the crowd, but she raised a hand, urging them to listen. This isn't about one ruling. It isn't about one case or one city. This is about every name that was never heard, every injustice that was never caught on camera, every person who suffered under a system that refused to see them as human. She scanned the faces before her, her heart heavy yet hopeful. We cannot afford to celebrate too soon. True justice isn't just about punishing those who are guilty. It's about preventing the next injustice before it happens. The crowd erupted again, this time not just in applause, but in purpose. They understood. This was bigger than one case. This was about rewriting the rules. As Isabella stepped down from the microphone, a young woman approached her. She was no older than 20, her hands gripping her phone, the same phone that had recorded Isabella's wrongful arrest all those months ago. "You changed everything," she said, her voice shaking. Isabella smiled, shaking her head slightly. "No," she corrected gently. "We did." The girl swallowed hard, nodding as her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. And in that moment, Isabella knew, this wasn't just a case, a fight, or even a victory. This was a movement, one built on courage, resilience, and the refusal to stay silent. A lesson for us all. This story isn't just about Isabella Carter. It's about every person who has ever faced injustice and chosen to stand up instead of stand down. It's about using our voices, our platforms, and our courage to demand better. Because justice is not a moment. It's a responsibility. And whether we fight in the courtroom, on the streets, or in the quiet moments when no one is watching, we are all part of the change. So now, I ask you, what will you do? Will you stand up for what's right? Will you demand accountability? Will you keep pushing, even when the fight feels endless? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. And if you believe in the power of stories to inspire action, hit that like button, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories that challenge, provoke, and push us toward a better world. Because the fight isn't over. It's only just beginning.